are in the world. And before we dive into this first IDFC webinar on linking finance and biodiversity, let me quickly introduce myself. I'm an independent, or you can go to the next slide, Antona. I'm an independent biodiversity expert, mostly working for the German financial and technical corporations, so KfW, Development Bank, and GNZ. And I have more than 10 years of experience in development cooperation, mostly focusing on analysis and political advisory work regarding biodiversity conservation. And I've also collected most of the information that can be found in the toolbox that will be introduced later on and will facilitate today's webinar. So before I give you an overview of today's agenda, let me introduce you to our hosts and speakers. So first up, we have Antonin Dersu, who already introduced himself. He works at the IDFC Secretariat and is in charge of the Biodiversity and Climate Change working groups. And he will also accompany today's Q&A later on. So if you have any questions during the webinar, please feel free to post them in the chat and we will see what we can discuss at the end of the session. Next, we have Becky Weil-Bohr, who is Chief Science Officer at NatCap, where she's responsible for overseeing model development. She's a quantitative ecologist with more than 10 years of experience at the interface between natural sciences and economics. And she's also experienced in working with clients from public and private sector to understand investment opportunities in natural capital and biodiversity. Next, we have Odile Conchou, Senior Advisor on Finance and Biodiversity at the French Agency for Development, AFD, and TNFD Development Finance Network Lead. She has more than 30 years of experience in the field of environment and biodiversity with various international organizations, financial institutions, local authorities, NGOs, and research centers, and has also worked as financial sector lead at the Secretariat of the UN Convention on Biological Diversity. And last but not least, we have Lydia von Krosigk, who is sector economist for biodiversity at the Department of Sector Policy at KfW Development Bank, and is responsible there for mainstreaming biodiversity into KfW projects and operations, and working with German ministries, international partners, and KfW's operational departments. And before joining KfW in Frankfurt, she lived in Namibia for many years, also working with KfW and the Namibian government on conservation projects. And she has also experienced working for several organizations such as the European Commission, FAO, WHO, and GSZ, and also in many countries such as Namibia, Botswana, Angola, Chad, Philippines, and India. So now Lydia and Antonin will welcome you and give you a short introduction to IDFC and the overall webinar series. So back to you, Antonin.
Thank you so much. So briefly to recall what is IDFC. IDFC is a network of 26 national and regional development banks from all over the world. We are the largest provider of green finance globally. In 2021, it was 224 billion US dollar, including 18 billions for biodiversity finance. Our main objective is to work together to implement the sustainable agenda, the Paris Agreement, and the coming Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework. And we are doing this through our 5 working groups, including the one on biodiversity that Lydia will present afterwards. So our main goals are to share knowledge and build a capacity within our institutions, and to align with international main agreements that I said before, and to increase cooperation between members and also with other partners like your institutions today. Lydia?
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Antonin, and welcome also from the Making Finance Work for Nature working group, where I from KfW are together with AFD and CAF are co-chairs of this working group. And yes, as the climate working group, we have regular meetings and activities. Several of you will take part in that already. And we hope to, of course, to generate more members or participants for this group. So at this stage already the invitation to please join also our regular meetings, this Making Finance Work for Nature working group. And what are here our specific objectives, just in very short? Some of you might know that already. It's also sharing knowledge on specific topics of biodiversity to develop a vision, reporting financing for biodiversity, to evaluate also biodiversity impacts of investments, and promote biodiversity in investments and nature positive economies. And that's what we are doing today, promote mainstreaming of biodiversity in public development banks. So, and just in very short, an overview of the main activities so far. That is, as Antonin mentioned already, the green finance mapping. I just wanted to give you this few figures from 2021. Which is 18 billion for biodiversity, and just in comparison that you see why there is still quite some work to do, is 224 billion for climate. So it's only 8% of this which is for biodiversity. And the toolbox, IDFC Toolbox on mainstreaming biodiversity in public development institutions, you'll see here the title or the first page of it, and of which you will hear more in this seminar. And on the left side there on the slide, you can see the IDFC Common Position Paper on biodiversity to support the Kunming-Montreal Global Diversity Framework, which is a very important document and commitment by the IDFC members. And of that also you will hear more details during the course of this seminar. And then the latest edition of basically of our activities, and where you have the honor to be part of, that is this IDFC seminar series on biodiversity, which will be a series of 4 webinars. That's what it's planned. And the main objective is to provide members with an overview of the debates around biodiversity mainstreaming, and also to help members to get acquainted with the toolbox and to support them in engaging in discussions about concepts, about approaches and tools around biodiversity in your own banks, in your own institutions, and in your own settings and countries where you are in. No? So that the toolbox, which was developed by IDFC, becomes a useful and hands-on tool which you can use in your work that you are doing at your institutions. Yes, and with that, the concrete dates for the next webinars are still finalized, but the next one will be in September. That is already for sure, and you will get informations on this and the concrete invitation and dates around this. So, and now we are looking forward to the content now, the content part, which is starting now. And with this, I hand over back to Naomi. Naomi, we cannot hear you yet.
Sorry, I was just about to ask you all to mute your microphones while mine was still muted. So if you could please, while you're not speaking, mute, because there was some paper noises, etc. That would be great. And also, Antonin, I don't know if it's not just me, but the slides are a bit cut off in the bottom. So I don't know if there's anything you could change about this, that we see all the content. Let me continue with the agenda. we thought that since the various IDFC members are at very different steps of the journey when it comes to integrating biodiversity, we would start this first webinar at the very basics. So next up, Becky Weilbohr will provide us with an overview about biodiversity and the concept of ecosystem services and why they are important for development finance institutions, short DFIs. And she will also talk about what risks DFIs face and why they should measure and manage their risks, impacts, and dependencies. Then next up, Odile Conchou will embed this within the international political context. So what consequences does the global biodiversity framework have for DFIs, and what other current international or regional developments are relevant for these institutions? And she will also talk a bit more about IDFC's positions and activities. And at the end, I will introduce the toolbox to you, especially its stepwise approach and step 1, which focuses on internal communication and convincing. And then at the end, as I mentioned, we hope to have some time left for a short Q&A. So now let's hear from Becky Weilbohr why financial institutions should be concerned about the state of the world's biodiversity. Thanks for joining us, Becky. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. And it's a pleasure to join you all today. We have the next slide, please. So I'll start with some definitions. So what I'll do is give you some framing and hopefully the basics on biodiversity, nature, ecosystem services, and what we're talking about, and why it's relevant for you now and going forward. Then I'll set out the differences maybe from what you've experienced so far, thinking about climate and how nature might be similar or different to those kinds of risks that you've already engaged with. And then I'll come to what does this all mean for you and for financial services in general, and what can we do about it? So I wanted to just put a health warning at the beginning that I will probably depress you all, but I promise that I will come around and give some positive solutions at the end. But starting with some definitions then, because often in this space, words are used interchangeably. So people talk about biodiversity or they talk about nature and ecosystem services. If we're being very strict about this, biodiversity the definition is the variety of living things on Earth. And so it's biological, it's biotic, it's the living part of nature. And then ecosystems and ecosystem services are the benefits that we as a society gain from nature. So living things and non-living things like water, air, certain parts of soils, how does that all come together into systems, and then how do we as a society benefit from that? So when people talk about biodiversity related financial risks or ecosystem services financial risks, they're often talking about the same thing here, which is ultimately nature related risks. And climate is actually a subset of that. Climate is part of the environment. We just historically happen to start with climate as the first crisis to deal with. Maybe with hindsight, we would have started on a broader view. But this is where we are. So when we're talking about biodiversity today, we're thinking about all the other parts of nature that are not climate. Can we take the next slide, please? Great. And why do we need to care about this? Well, the economic system is completely dependent on nature and biodiversity. There was a report in 2020, the World Economic Forum published, which said that half of global GDP is either moderately or highly dependent on nature. But we all know that the reality is that all of GDP is dependent to some degree on nature. It underpins everything that we do on this planet. It's the truism of that, everybody eats food, everybody breathes air. So there isn't a single part of the economic system that wouldn't be affected by the collapse of nature. And the highly dependent industries, so 15% of global GDP is highly dependent on nature, and that includes things like construction, agriculture, food and beverages. Those are the three largest sectors, but really all of the economy will be impacted in some way. That's the takeaway here. We take the next slide, please. And the reason why we worry about this is because biodiversity is in decline. And this is a sort of typical graph that you might see. It's Global Living Planet Index, but there are lots of wealth of studies that show that biodiversity is in decline and has been for many, many years. So this graph is looking at the last 50 years. We see almost to 70% decline in wildlife globally. And you'll see similar statistics for coral reef systems, fish stocks being overfished. A third of them are overfished. A third of the world topsoil is degraded. More than 85% of wetlands have been lost. So it doesn't really matter which ecosystem we're looking at. The message is really the same. Large declines in biodiversity and degradation in ecosystems. So this is something which is critical and something that we need to address. Can we take the next slide, please? Another reason why this is important to address is that the crisis of climate change and the crisis of biodiversity collapse are intimately linked, and they're also linked to human systems and human well-being. So we can't disentangle social issues with climate change from biodiversity. Many of these challenges interact with each other. So one of the key drivers of biodiversity loss is climate change. One of the key sources of greenhouse gas emissions is the loss of habitats. And both of those ultimately underpin human systems. So we need to think of these things as a whole and not treat them in isolation. Take the next slide, please. And this, many of you might have seen before, but it's such a good one that I like to show it again. This is the scale of the problem. So it's worth noting that climate change is an important crisis that we need to address, but nature and biodiversity collapse is of equal magnitude, if not a greater challenge. So we're on the path to tackling climate change, and people are starting to think about what they can do there. Biodiversity is as big a challenge, and we should be thinking about these things together. We take the next slide, please. So what I thought I would do is just pull out some of the ways in which, when you're thinking about nature and nature-related risks, they will differ slightly from what you may have been engaging with on climate. Because the framing for nature and nature-related risks can be quite similar, but the solutions and the challenges that nature-related risks pose can be a little different to climate. So I thought I'd pull some of those out. So the first is that drivers of biodiversity loss or nature degradation are multiple and interconnected. So whereas with climate, really it's the release of greenhouse gas emissions that is the problem. And if we can overcome that driver, we can solve the issue. With biodiversity, there are multiple threats. So it might be land use change or invasive species or pollution or overfishing, overexploitation, and climate change as well. And in any given ecosystem, it might be one or more of these. So when we're looking for solutions, we have to think about tackling multiple drivers and think about systems as a whole. So there won't be one simple fix for this. We take the next slide, please. The other thing to embrace about dealing with and understanding biodiversity is the complexity of having no universal measurement unit. So for climate, we have a single unit, it's sort of greenhouse gases or CO2 equivalent, and we measure all drivers of climate change, if you like, on the same unit. The same is not true for biodiversity. And there is not likely to be a single unit for biodiversity. So we're going to need to sort of lean in and embrace that complexity with multiple metrics and then multiple targets against those, whether it's looking at the connectivity of landscapes or the richness of different species in a particular site. Take the next slide, please. So number 3, I think is an important one. It's that biodiversity and ecosystem services are non-substitutable. And again, this might not seem obvious immediately, but when we're dealing with the issue of climate, we have a single unit, CO2 equivalent, and that unit is the same whether that carbon is emitted in London or in Lisbon or in Lagos. It doesn't really matter. It's the same carbon that goes into the atmosphere, and so we can substitute solutions to that, and we can build trading systems in order to offset in one area and emit in others. The same is not true for biodiversity because, a mangrove is not equivalent to a species-rich grassland. And in fact, nor are different ecosystem services equivalent. So we can't increase soil quality whilst decreasing water quality and have those two things be interchangeable. And one area where this comes out, where if we try to maximize one service over another, we see perverse outcomes. So example on the right is a monoculture tree cropping. So planting non-native species of eucalyptus at scale. Fantastic for dealing with climate change. It sequesters carbon at a very high rate, but can be devastating for local biodiversity and can disrupt local water supplies because it's such a water demanding crop. So that's an example where maximizing for carbon without considering the system and considering biodiversity and water and other elements, you can get perverse outcomes and trade-offs in ecosystem services. So that's something to bear in mind here. Can we take the next slide, please? So another one where nature can be a little more complex than climate is around location and scale. So as we were saying before, with carbon, it doesn't matter where in the world the carbon is emitted because the atmosphere is by and large well mixed and uniform, and so we can treat all emissions as equivalent. For biodiversity and ecosystem services, the location is really important. So it can be hyper-localized. If you're thinking about the service of pollination to certain crops, then insect pollinators only fly 1 or 2 kilometers from their nesting site. So that the intactness of that population is very localized to you. And then we can think about hydrological processes which flow and are directional, so upstream to downstream. And some species have migratory routes which are thousands of kilometers. So scale is important here and location is important. And that's why under TNFD and other reporting frameworks, there is a locate phase at the very beginning of the process, and understanding where the assets are that you are invested in and the supply chains into the companies that you're invested in. That is going to be really critical to understanding the interaction with nature. And is one of the biggest challenges that I think we face in this space, is actually locating those activities and doing it well. Can we take the next slide, please? So lastly, nature responds to disturbances in non-linear ways. And this, in fairness, is true for biodiversity, for climate change as well, but I thought it was worth repeating, which is natural systems have often thresholds and tipping points, which is that the system can be in a sort of renewable state and a stable state, and we can continue to degrade it at a constant rate until such time as it reaches a threshold.
Comemos uma coisinha, está com dor na barriga, você comeu pão francês gelado inteiro.
Becky, you're muted right now. If you could unmute, great.
Thank you. So it reaches a threshold, beyond which time the system can flip into a different state. So an example of this might be coral bleaching events, where the temperature of the sea rises and rises until such time as it becomes too warm, and then we see these kind of widespread bleaching events. And another might be overfishing of populations, where we can fish fish stocks and a population really sustainably forever, but if we overfish them, eventually we'll reach a point where the population will collapse. And the example of North Atlantic cod, those numbers have not recovered since that population collapsed. The reason why this is important is because often the models behind sort of financial modeling don't take account of these critical risks and these kind of catastrophic risks as well as they could and should. And so what we tend to do is underestimate the risks around pushing ecosystems towards these tipping points or thresholds. And so that's something to really be aware of with these systems. We're talking about safe operating systems and trying to stay within sustainable limits of these ecosystems. We have the next slide, please. Thank you. And was a little bit shifted around, but hopefully you can see. You may well have seen a graph like this, looking at climate risks and how they propagate through financial systems. It's very similar for nature. We can think about it in a similar way. So on the left-hand side, we can think about hazards, and behind there it says shocks. So these can be either physical shocks, where we lose biodiversity, we lose ecosystem services, either acutely, and that can come out as sort of pandemics, which we've sort of experienced, or chronic shocks like soil degradation, where we lose yields through time. But there can also be transition shocks, and so examples of this would be where business practices or policies come in that change the requirements of how you operate, what you need to disclose, and that can be costly to keep up. And so there's a risk to your operation simply that that you're on the back foot and you're not in line with incoming regulations. So both of those can cause issues for financial institutions, and then that transmits through the system, either as microeconomic impacts or macroeconomic impacts, and then through to credit risk and market risk and other types of risk. I guess one thing to point out here, which might be interesting to this group as well, is about double materiality, which is that as a financial institution, you will contribute to the risks of which you are also exposed. And so, you know, example of this, a very small scale, it would be farmers if they are degrading their soils, but they then lose yield as a result of degraded soil. So they're both responsible for the degradation and also the risk from that. And that coupling means that you have more power and more control, and there's more an incentive to do something about it, because you both feel the risk and you have the power to do something about it, which is perhaps more tightly coupled for biodiversity in some cases than it is for climate, where we tend to feel a little bit more helpless. If we have the next slide, please. So I promised you that I would depress you and then come around and hopefully convince you that there are some solutions here. So one of the great things to think about with biodiversity and with climate is that there are win-win solutions. So you won't be able to see everything on this slide. And don't worry, the thing that I really want you to take away is that in blue, at the top panel, we're looking at which actions for climate also have positive outcomes for biodiversity. And anything in blue is a climate action which also has positive outcome for biodiversity. Red is good for climate and bad for biodiversity. And on the bottom panel, the same, looking at, this time, biodiversity actions that have positive impacts on climate. And again, blue is a win-win situation. So you can see there's far more blue here than there are red. There are trade-offs. There are some things that you can do for one which is detrimental to the other. But if we actively are aware of that and seek them out, then there are win-win solutions here which are more cost-effective and can address both of the crises, the climate and biodiversity crises. And next slide, please. And so my final slide is really thinking about what can the finance industry do about this? And I pulled out just a few examples that I thought were worth highlighting, but of course, this seminar series is about exactly that, about what you can do to engage with this problem. So there will be other things that you can do as well. But the three that I pulled out, one is about understanding the problem and where you are. And so on that, it would be about quantifying and disclosing your impacts and dependencies on nature or those in your portfolio. So yes, aligning with emerging disclosure frameworks such as TNFD and SBTN. Be aware that the transition risks are going to be increasing through time. So act early and educate yourselves early on. And location of assets is going to be a real challenge in this space, but is absolutely critical to really understanding impacts and dependencies on nature. So starting that process early to map out assets and supply chains and helping people to do that. And then number two, improving financial models for nature, but I would go further and say there's a there's an element here about stewardship. So what can we do to understand these risks better and then apply them to financial institutions and financial models and help companies and businesses and countries understand this better? So what can we do to support them on this journey, because it is complicated and it will take time and we don't have a lot of that. So what can we do to support them? And then lastly, identifying new investment opportunities. There is a lot of opportunity in this space, both for nature positive investments as a nudge towards enhancing positive behaviors. There are emerging asset classes. Nature tech is expanding as well, and lots of thematic equities are coming up on sort of natural capital funds. So there's a lot of levers that we can pull in terms of structuring financial products or supporting institutions to really make a positive change in this space. So I think I will leave it there. Hopefully that's a positive enough note to pass on to the next speaker.
Thank you, Becky, very much for this concise and impressive, but also hopeful overview of some of the reasons why we're working on the integration of biodiversity in development finance institutions and also the challenges connected to this aim. So yeah, like Becky said, we will follow on with these last options of what to do in the following webinars. So stay tuned for those. And as I mentioned, there will be a short Q&A at the end, but if there are any clarification questions that should be answered straight away, feel free to speak up, or I think there's nothing in the chat so far, so if there are no questions right now, let us transition to the next input by Odile Conchou, who will talk to us about the international political context, especially focusing on the global biodiversity framework and its consequences for DFIs. So we kind of heard the why should we measure and manage impacts, risks, and dependencies from a risk point of view, and now we hear why we should care from a political point of view. Odile, you have the word.
Thank you, Naomi, and good afternoon or morning or evening for all of you, and really happy to be there with my colleagues from KfW and IDFC and all the others. So yes, I will try to describe the international political context because it's a complicated one since the COP15. So perhaps let's go first to the COP15 and see what happened after. You surely heard that and perhaps saw this slide before, but that's true. That was an historic moment for the biodiversity of the same importance as the COP21 for climate change. First of all, because if we speak of financial institution, honestly, that was the first time that they participated in such a number. In this COP biodiversity, they are used to the COP climate, but not this one. And it was also the occasion to adopt, it was not sure at the beginning, but the global biodiversity framework, the same as the Paris Agreement, but not only that, 5 other documents mentioned here, which really allow for an operational dimension of the implementation of this global biodiversity framework, so a strategy of resource mobilization, an implementation mechanism, a monitoring framework, a capacity building mechanism, and even an agreement on DSI, which is a digital sequencing information, how to share the benefits of genetic resources. So real progress compared to what was in place before, the Aichi target, the previous agreement, and something more ambitious and more operational. If we go to the next slide, we see that this GBF mention and promote a vision for 2050 to live in harmony with nature, which is reflected in 4 objectives, 4 goals. The reduction of the 5 pressures mentioned before by Becky on biodiversity, the 5 pressure highlighted by the IPBES. The sustainable use of biodiversity, the sharing of benefits of, as I mentioned before, of genetic resources, and also a description of what are the financial and non-financial means of implementation. In between, the GBF give a mission to all the 196 countries who signed this agreement, which is to halt and reverse biodiversity loss by 2030 in 7 years. So we have very, very short time for that. And it is described in 23 targets, which have to be implemented now, really now. What does it mean for the public development banks and also for the others? Antonin, please, the next slide. Yes. First of all, what we heard during the COP, that was a very high expectation vis-à-vis development banks. Perhaps and surely mainly for the multilateral development banks, but also for all the others. The first thing was the need to align the financial flows, the public and also the private, with the global biodiversity framework that's in the goal D, and it means greening finance and financing green. Becky spoke a bit about it, and I will come back after. A strong expectation of increasing the finance for biodiversity, but also be able to say what we are all financing with some tracking methodology and tool in order to give some figures and numbers. And also to play its role of supporting the developing country, capacity building, and so on. Strong expectation, as I said, in financing the implementation of the GBF, either by reducing the amount of harmful subsidies, which come normally from government, but a lot through public banks. And they massively subsidize activities that contribute to the destruction of biodiversity. So a strong view on that, how to identify and eliminate them. Then in the target 19, how to mobilize all sources of finance, public, private, national, international, and how to triple the financial flows to developing countries with $30 billion by 2030. And we are specifically, public development banks are specifically concerned by this last point. It can come directly from them, from countries, from them, but also by leveraging the private sector or by developing new financial mechanisms. I will also come back on that later on. One specific global financial mechanism was also negotiated. That means the creation of a trust fund under the GEF, the Global Environmental Fund, and this trust fund has been created last week during the GEF Council in Brazil. So it's now running and will be a new and important source of finance for biodiversity. What implication next for PDBs? It's to support and finance the conservation of biodiversity, the famous 30 by 30, so protection of 30% of land and 30% of ocean on the earth, and the restoration of the good state of biodiversity, all that as the 3 first targets of the GBF, and also the mainstreaming of biodiversity in all the economic sectors, focusing mainly on agriculture, fisheries, forestries. Something really important for the financial sector, that's, Bessie mentioned that just before, the obligation in the target 15 for large companies, transnational corporations and financial institutions to assess, report and disclose their nature-related risk, impact and dependencies on their operation, supply and value chain, and also portfolio. And that is really, really new in such a biodiversity world, if I can say. And the TNFD has a place to play with other type of tools and frameworks. And the last point is that all that has to be made also by involving all type of actors, especially the most vulnerable, as the indigenous people and local communities, IPLCs, women, girls. And there is also a strong focus in this global biodiversity framework on the human rights. So environment and social purposes, biodiversity, and also climate. I forgot to say that, but climate is mentioned several times, and the link between both is mentioned several times. So since the COP, the international mobilization has continued. It was not an end, with several international events, as the One Forest Summit, the IC Treaty, the Paris Summit for a New Global Financial Pact last week, So things are evolving. International coalition either begun or continue to work, and I would mention the coalition of businesses, Business for Nature, of financial institutions as IDFC, the Fixed Financing Common, but also Finance for Biodiversity Pledge, that's the private finance, the big NGOs and so on. They are all pushing for integrating biodiversity in our economic sectors and mainstreaming it. What are now the key topics? Because we've seen what is in the GBF, but how is the discussion continuing? There is a strong focus, and perhaps more than before, on the nexus between climate and biodiversity. Was Becky mentioned several times, but really coming from climate to biodiversity, or biodiversity beyond climate, how you want, but really a strong focus between and a strong nexus between both. And after that, a strong focus also on how to finance. The rules are there, but how to finance all that, restoration, conservation of biodiversity, nature-based solution, the vital reserve of carbon and biodiversity. That's perhaps a new concept, if I can say, coming from the One Forest Summit, protecting lands for climate and biodiversity co-benefits. Also a lot of work to develop innovative mechanisms as debt for nature swaps, sustainability sovereign bonds, the green and blue bonds, also biodiversity certificates. A lot of people are working on that now. Strong focus also on how to mobilize the private sector. You surely heard about that. And with some work also on the risk reduction mechanism, guarantees, blended finance, insurance, and so on. How to enable also the financial sector to work, some regulation begin to happen. What are the incentives that has to be developed in order to convince also the financial sector to move? And the final point, and I surely forgot things, are the metrics, targets, and data that have already been mentioned today also, and the need to report and disclose what is being done or what will be done. And it makes a clear link with the TNFD, Task Force for Nature-Related Financial Disclosure. In the next slide, please. That Bessie also mentioned. It's one of the tools and framework that is being developed in order to help the corporates and financial institutions to be able to assess first, to monitor, report, and disclose what they are doing in terms of nature-related risk, impact dependencies, and also opportunities. I mention it because we are quite active in this in the development of this framework, and the different networks of development banks have been, with the private sector, have been involved at minimum to say what they are thinking about it and how it could be used. It's a tool. It's not a standard, it's a framework to help to report based on the different standards and regulation appearing. It's based on the concept of double materiality. I don't need to explain it, it was done before. They get a strong political support from government, G7, G20, large investors, regulators, and so on. As I said, the COP15 gave a strong input to that. And it's a market-led initiative, but with a lot of partners from expertise, science, public, private, and so on. It's an iterative process. After more than 18 years of work, the final version will be launched mid-September this year and will be able to be used after that by corporates and financial institutions. Next slide, please. And it's a bit complicated, this one, so I will try to explain that. It's to say, as I said, it's one of the tools and frameworks that is being developed now regarding the reporting on climate and biodiversity. On top of that, you have the two main policies, which are the Paris Agreement and the GBF for the biodiversity. 4 main frameworks have been developed or are being developed in order to help companies to report, as I just said before, TCFD and science-based target for climate, TNFD and science-based nature target, SBTN, target for nature, for biodiversity. They are based, or they will answer to standards, international standards, and it begins to be more and more complicated. You surely know the GRI, which is perhaps more linked to the reporting on impacts and not on risk. Beside of that, you have the IFRS, the foundation, which launched 2 years ago the ISSB, which is the International Sustainability Standard Boards, which is designed to define reporting standards there also relating to sustainable development in order to meet investors' need for environmental information. The ISSB launched last week or the week before the two first standards. One is a global standard on the reporting for the listed companies and financial institutions, and the second one is for climate standard. So honestly, I don't know exactly how nature is incorporated, but I think it will come later on. That's what I said at the COP15. What we hear mainly is that it's mainly based on the risk approach, but not on risk and impact. So it is not yet a double materiality standard, but a single materiality standard just on risk. At EU level, that's not in this figure, you have also the Corporate Sustainable Reporting Directive for companies above 250 staff, also to report on climate and biodiversity, and you have the famous taxonomy, which define and classify economic activities that have a positive impact on environment. Above that, you have regulations, different from the different where you are in the world. And all that, and it's really complicated, I agree, is done and defined to help companies and financial institutions to report on what they are doing on climate and biodiversity. What we can say on that is that like that, it appears to be really complicated. I think it is, in fact. The thing is that they are all trying to work together in order to align what they are asking, more or less, and so to not create more trouble for companies and financial institutions than necessary. But for sure, the landscape is quite complicated now. So it comes to, I will come back now to what and how can financial institutions and above all public development banks, because it's our purpose, align with the GBF and be compliant with all the things I described before. This slide is just to mention, but I want to go further, a report that has been done by WWF 2 years ago on public development banks and biodiversity. Honestly, that's quite interesting and it gives you a lot of information. But I will go directly to the next slide. And what can be and could be a roadmap for public development banks to, as I said, align and be compliant to the GBF and other international standards. There are 2-3 different things. The first thing is surely to think about what to do. You will see it's compliant for sure with what Bessie said, the last slide, and a bit different also. The first thing for sure is to think about what will be done and to develop internally a strategy and a roadmap, for sure. And after that, the things are in two different ways. Aligning that increasing finance for biodiversity and for nature positive projects. First, begin by look at what you are already financing and try to reduce, to avoid, to reduce or to offset, compensate the negative impacts on biodiversity. So not only providing new money, but first look at what is existing and try to avoid negative impact. Mainstreaming biodiversity, I spoke of that before, across the portfolio and financing conservation, the third level, restoration, conservation and so on, and then contributing to the 30 by 30 targets. For that, it's also important or necessary to mobilize the private sector and to leverage the private finance. The second way is to assess and manage nature-related risk, impact, dependencies at portfolio level, and use that to take also some decision, and after that, be able to report and disclose on this risk and impacts. And if I come to my last slide, that's what Naomi told at the beginning. What is IDFC doing in that way? And you will see that IDFC took a list of commitments last year through this common position paper that has been launched at the COP15 by its chair to support the ambition of the GBF. And if you look at the list of commitments, that's more or less what I told before. So mainly, how can IDFC members be aligned with the GBF and be aligned also more or less with the new regulation standard and so on arriving on the market. So I won't repeat, you can read it, and that's clearly what I mentioned before. Perhaps the only things that I didn't mention before was in the financing, in the increase of finance for biodiversity, to allocate a substantive part of climate finance to projects that have co-benefits in biodiversity, and by so linking more climate and biodiversity finance. All that has to be done by 2027. And the last commitment that has been taken by IDFC is to mobilize over 100 billion in biodiversity finance, not per year, but in 5 years, and also by 2027 to help achieve these goals. So with that, I think it makes a good introduction to the 3 next sessions of our training. And I give the floor back to Naomi. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Odile, for putting the whole topic into the international context and also already offering some practical steps how to align with the GBF. And as you and also Becky mentioned, in addition to the GBF, as you might know, there's more and more regional and national regulations, such as the EU taxonomy, as well as national laws coming up to manage and report on impacts and risks. So it's not actually only in the responsibility of the DFIs, but also in their best self-interest to go ahead and integrate biodiversity into strategies and operations. And in order to provide some guidance on how to go about this, IDFC has developed the toolbox, which, as Lydia mentioned, is a collection of reports, tools, frameworks, and approaches. And it consists of a short text at the beginning, covering some of the aspects that Becky referred to earlier, and then suggests a stepwise approach for integrating biodiversity concerns. And of course, where an institution would start at this process depends on its stage of integration. And also the order of the steps could be changed. So this kind of starts a bit earlier than Odile just mentioned, not at the developing a strategy, but first having some internal communication and convincing to get this process started. But we will look at the steps one by one on the next slide. Just one more word about the structure of the toolbox. So for each step, related tools and frameworks and or approaches are introduced. And they're mostly structured in the same way to provide a first overview about a tool, its pros and cons, and also where to find more information. So if we look at the steps one by one, we believe that before any integration process can really start, in many institutions, there will need to be some sort of internal convincing, because biodiversity is not as present as climate change. So CEOs and other colleagues might first need to be made aware that biodiversity is an important topic to include. So this we would suggest as a step 1 in case you need to raise awareness first. And this is what this webinar is also covering today. Then step 2, we would have the identification of risks, impacts, and opportunities, for example, using footprinting methodologies or IVAT or CORE. And step 3, we would see the development of a biodiversity strategy and targets, for example, also using exclusion lists and science-based targets, as Adil mentioned. And these two steps will be covered in webinar 2. And we see this sort of as the foundation for the whole process. The next step would then be capacity development, for example, provided by We Value Nature. And step 5, we would see the management of risks and impacts, for example, by using safeguards and applying the mitigation hierarchy. And step 6, we have included the increase of biodiversity positive investments using green financial products, or also, as mentioned, nature-based solution projects and products. And these topics will be covered in webinar 3. And the final 2 steps are monitoring and reporting, for example, using the GRI standards as mentioned, or the TNFD reporting framework. And step 8 would be information and knowledge sharing with, for example, government partners and peers to really get this topic on a broad level. And these 2 will be covered by webinar 4. If we look at step 1, could you put the next slide up? As I said, the first step, the aim of it would be to increase awareness within an institution on both the benefits of incorporating biodiversity concerns, but also the risks of not taking them into account. And it also provides some information on prioritizing certain sectors and subsectors which are most relevant for nature-related risks. And the first step in the toolbox differs a bit from the following ones, as we do not directly cover any tools, but rather provide links to reports that offer an argumentation basis that could be used for raising awareness. So today's webinar could also be seen as a source for this step, as the 2 inputs we heard today could be used to communicate the need to pay attention to biodiversity. And on the next slide, I will not read that out. We just copied a selection of reports that you could check out if you need arguments to convince your colleagues that biodiversity is the next hot topic for your institution. And with this, I'm already coming to an end, and I will pass over to Antonin in case there are any questions in the chat.
Thank you so much, Naomi. Yes, we have a couple of questions in the chat. First one, maybe for Odile or Lydia. Do we have an update summary on the different on what the different DFIs have committed publicly to achieve? So this is the first question, and maybe just to give you some time to think about. Second question is, how can the new GBF fund contribute to close the biodiversity finance gap? What do financial institutions need from the GBF fund to mobilize finance for biodiversity? And finally, last question.
Maybe we take them step by step, Antonin.
Yeah, okay.
I think otherwise we are getting confused. I can maybe start with the first one. Yeah, what did the different IDFC members pledge, or what are their targets and so on? So no, we know what was spent in the past. As you have seen the figures in the beginning, what 18 billion so far, that was in 2021. The 2022 figures are not yet out. They will be coming out soon. And only, I think, 6 or 8 of the IDFC members are reporting on this. So there is still, yeah, room for improvement. And if individual IDFC members have done pledges, I think AFD has done a pledge on 30%. Maybe the AFD can come in themselves. KfW has a climate pledge so far, but not a biodiversity one yet. But Germany has one. Germany has pledged 1.5 billion on biodiversity by the year 2025. So that is the pledge, and that's where they're all individual pledges. But yeah, it would be an idea to say, look, I mean, at least for the IDFC members, to collect the different pledges, and maybe also to call out some sort of a competition, who has the best or the highest pledge of that. Yeah.
Just to complete, yes, there is no public from each IDFC member, and as Lydia said, in IFT we have committed above all on the amount of finance dedicated to biodiversity, 1 billion by 2025, which is doubling of what we used to finance in 2020, and also committing or using 30% of our climate finance to project with co-benefits in biodiversity. But we don't know for all the others, except the fact that they have committed to implement the common position paper. We had a meeting just last week with all the CEOs to see how to advance, how to work on this common position paper, but no public commitment from each organization yet. Perhaps I can answer the second question.
No, maybe we can before that, if there are pledges from other banks or whom you are representing, if you know of pledges or so, please, I think, come in there as well. It's not just for us to answer that. Julie, you asked the question, what is your DBSA pledge or commitment? Do you have one?
Well, Lydia, I'm working with the DBSA units right now to make one. And the question everyone always asks is, what have the other banks done? Because that always inspires a bank to come forward with their pledge if they know what the others have done. So, it's really helpful. The AFD is really leading that way, and we're so grateful for them. And I'm sure BNDES is on this call as well, and they've got something also to put in.
Okay. BNDES. Somebody here.
I think they left.
Good.
So maybe we can move to the second question. If some other institutions want to react later.
Sorry, what was the question for BNDES from DBSA?
The question is, do you have a pledge or a target within BNDES for biodiversity?
Well, I don't know if some of my colleagues from the environmental division that work with biodiversity would like to step in and complete. But I know that BNDES is one of those IDFC members that report on the green finance mapping on biodiversity. And because especially on the geographical features of Brazil, and so BNDES has a strong goal on biodiversity, and we have many projects in connection with the Amazon biome and also other biomes, and having products of match also from grants, match funding, and blended finance for bioeconomy and biodiversity. But I don't know if any of my colleagues from the environmental division would like to step in the discussion.
Yes, thank you.
So in the meantime, JICA just wrote that they are now struggling to set targets on indicators too. And they would be interesting to know more about what kind of targets on indicators other GFIs set.
Well, I would say join our second webinar in September, because we cover the topic of biodiversity strategy and target setting.
Perfect teaser. Thank you, Naomi. So maybe we can jump to the second question, which was on the GBF fund. Odile, you wanted to answer?
Yes, yes, for sure. The GBF is, if I remember well, the question, the GBF fund will contribute to close the biodiversity finance gap. I'm not sure it will completely close it. I'm sure that not. But it will be a part, because in fact there is not one tool which is necessary, but several tools or pockets, if I can say, which are necessary. So it will be one. Relatively important above all for developing countries, and it's more or less mainly focused for them. It will, for now, because it's quite new, what I read and know is that they divided, we don't have a final amount for this fund, because now it's created and they have to receive some money. I know that Canada promised more than 150 million, for example, of dollars, but we don't know the final amount of this fund. And they will divide this pocket for least poor countries and more developed countries, for pocket which will be co-finance also with the public development banks and also private banks if they participate to these funds. That's the idea. Also a pocket which has been decided at the last moment, that 20% of the project financed by this fund will go to the IP, will go to projects managed and perhaps designed also by IPLCs, indigenous people and local community, which you know are really important actors in the conservation and preservation of nature and so on. So it's created. We don't know exactly how much will be in, but they define the governance, they define the sources, not the sources, but the type of countries or actors which could be financed through the fund, and that's mainly projects that will be financed, but also from what I understand and heard, it's also development of capacities, perhaps regulation and so on, so more enabling conditions also. And what do financial institutions need from the fund to mobilize finance for biodiversity? I'm not sure I completely understand your question, except if it's the help to finance and help countries to develop the enabling condition, I guess, or a source of co-financing also from public money to de-risk the private finance. That's perhaps two elements of answer to your question. Am I right? Or do you want to precise your question, or someone also explain if...
Yeah, so I can just clarify basically. So at IDRI, we're currently working. Can you hear me?
Yes,
well?
Yes.
So at IDRI, which is a think tank, we're working on the development of this new fund in the context of biodiversity finance. And we're trying to understand which are the ways in which financial institutions, because we haven't been looking so much at national development banks, but more like multilateral. And we've been asking them sort of like, what is it that they need from this new fund? Because there has been quite a lot of obstacles for development banks to mobilize biodiversity finance with the finance that they have received from the GEF up until now. And so I was just wondering, since we don't have like that much experience from national development banks, sort of like what are the things that they need from this new fund or just international funds more broadly. So like, for instance, there has been mention of how they need to know that they're going to receive the funds in advance in order to prepare better their products, or that they want to not have the double burden of having two different types of paperwork for each project when they already have sort of like their due diligence processes already in place. So these are like one of the things that we've received in terms of feedback, but only from multilateral development banks. So it would be interesting to hear from national ones as well.
I don't know if anyone wants to answer. Perhaps the time is short, but what could be made? As Lydia said, we are co-chairing together with CAF this working group on finance, on biodiversity. And that could be something in order to have more time and to think about it, because that's a really important question that we could raise to our members, and send you a synthesis of what are the needs and wishes regarding the fund. Because first, I think that people need more information on that because it's quite new, and second, it will give us some time to have internal answers and responses to you, and send you and the Jeff, for example, our desire, requirements, and needs also. That could be something interesting for our working group also to work on it. What do you think of that?
Yeah, for sure.
So perhaps you will speak about that elsewhere, but it would be interesting to have a more clear and description of what you want, and we can work together on that. Would be interesting, I think.
Yeah, for sure. Who should I contact for this? Should I write my email in the chat box, or?
Antonin Dersu at the Secretariat.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
Thank you, Irene. And I just saw in the chat that Eva from EIB just completed on the GBF fund, saying that there has only been a symbolic commitment from Canada and China, and other donors are waiting to see what is being offered and also what is being put on the tables, specifically in terms of loss and damage. So there are still a lot of work going on. So we are almost at the end of this first session. Also, I would like to say that the toolbox is just a voluntary way for PDBs to implement biodiversity strategies and operations. There are no mandatory things within this toolbox. But of course,
maybe at this stage, Antonin, maybe at this stage we could also just mention again. It was also briefly mentioned that last week there was a steering committee, IDFC steering committee, where 12 of the CEOs have been present, and one of the sessions at the steering committee was a biodiversity session. And there was a input by Professor Rockström from the Potsdam Institute of Climate Research. And what we can say is that the CEOs, after this input and after in the following discussion, I mean, there was quite a big, I think it made quite a big impact, this presentation and this discussion on it. So we had the feeling, since we were present from the working group, from the co-chairs, this might change also at the organizational level, that from high level is maybe also coming more support, and really for this working group, but for all the people who are working in the different institutions on this topic. So let's wait and see what is going to follow also from our all CEO levels of our organizations.
Thank you, Lilia. Also to recall that IDFC has a common position since COP15, as it was presented with a financial target of $100 billion in 5 years for biodiversity. Maybe Naomi, I will give you the floor for the.
Yeah, thank you very much for this discussion, and I think it's a very good idea to pick this up, to collect pledges by the different members, and maybe also targets that members have set, and also discuss what will be needed for the GBF fund. And in the next webinar, we will also cover some more content of the toolbox, as I mentioned. So the next session will focus on the identification of risks and opportunities, and also the development of a biodiversity strategy and targets. So with this, I would like to thank our speakers and the audience for your participation, and I hope to see you at the next webinar. Thank you very much, and have a nice rest of the day. Bye-bye.
Thank you, and bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much. Bye.